Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the fading light of a small medieval village, where the sun seems to hesitate just above the horizon, casting the church in a warm amber glow that makes its stones look like they've been steeped in honey. The air is cool, damp with the day's lingering mist, and somewhere nearby the slow clank of a cowbell drifts across the fields. The path beneath your boots is uneven, worn cobbles.
Nice.
With tufts of grass pressing up between the cracks, and you can feel the day's warmth fading away with every step toward the looming building ahead. You probably wouldn't survive long here without a good understanding of the rules, both the ones the priest preaches on Sunday, the quiet, unwritten ones that everyone seems to follow without question. The church is more than just a place to pray. It's the heart of the village, the anchor in storms, both literal and otherwise. And tonight, as you approach its heavy oak door, you notice something most travelers might overlook. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location and the local time down in the comments. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The church stands solid, and sure, its thick walls streaked with lichen and age, its roof a patchwork of moss and weather-darkened tiles. A low stone wall circles the yard, and just beyond it, crooked gravestones tilt at odd angles as though listening to the secrets of the earth. You push open the gate, its iron hinges squealing in protest, and follow the narrow path to the entrance. Doorway rises before you, an arched frame of pale limestone, worn smooth in places where centuries of hands have brushed past. The heavy oak door is shut, but it's the stonework that holds your attention. It's subtle at first, so subtle you wonder if you're imagining it. Tiny incisions, almost like scratches, etched into the frame. Not letters, not quite pictures, but something deliberate, something made with care. A gust of wind carries the scent of damp earth and wood smoke from the cottages beyond the churchyard. You pause, running your fingers over the marks. They're faint beneath the pad of your thumb, until they catch the light differently, revealing themselves as more than just the random pitting of old stone. Some are loops, 2 or 3 interlocking circles that spiral without end. Others are faint starbursts, their lines radiating like the spokes of a wheel. You lean closer, imagining the mason's chisel biting into the stone centuries ago. Each tap deliberate, each pattern serving a purpose far beyond decoration. Bell tower overhead creaks faintly in the wind, its wooden beams shifting with the years. And you can hear a distant flutter of winged pigeons roosting just out of sight. Behind you, the village seems smaller now, the sounds muffled, as though the church's presence wraps the yard in a different kind of stillness. You trace one more carving with your finger, and it's then you realize the door is flanked by these marks on both sides, almost like sentries. The right-hand column bears more circles, some overlapping into a pattern that feels too precise to be an accident. On the left, faint angled lines cut into the stone, forming a shape like an elongated maw. Local legend comes to mind, one you half remember from a book or maybe an old documentary. The idea that these marks weren't just for decoration. They were meant to guard the threshold, to keep out what the villagers feared most. And in a world where the night carried more than just the absence of light, that kind of protection was worth carving into stone itself. Historians still argue whether these marks were universally understood or just local traditions, passed quietly between the mason and the villagers. Some suggest they were blessings. Others think they were wards against ill will or darker forces that might slip in when no one was watching. As the last edge of sunlight slips below the horizon, the carvings seem to deepen, shadows pooling in the grooves. You imagine stepping through this doorway centuries ago? The comfort you might feel knowing those marks were there, silent guardians in the cold. And standing here now, you can almost sense that same quiet promise they're still watching. Still holding their place? Asterisk, the hinges groan softly as you ease the church door open. It's just enough for the cool breath of the nave to spill out. Inside, the air smells of beeswax, old wood, and a faint mineral temps that seeps up from the flagstone floor. Your footsteps echo gently, swallowed by the high vault overhead where the ribs of the ceiling arch like the bones of some patient, slumbering beast. Candles flicker along the side aisles, their light trembling across worn pews, polished by generations of parishioners shifting in their seats. You drift toward the doorway from the inside now, letting your eyes adjust to the change in light. From here, the protective carvings frame the world beyond, the village. Dim and muted under an indigo sky, the crooked rooftops huddled together as if they too were seeking shelter. It's here, in the hush between the bells' tolls, that you notice something else marks you hadn't seen from outside. On the inner frame, where the stone meets the wood, faint burn marks rise in curling patterns, like the trails of tiny, deliberate flames. At first glance, you think they're just scorched scars from careless candle placement. But no, these are too precise, too evenly spaced. Small, circular impressions, as though someone had pressed a heated, metal rod into the stone over and over again. You remember reading about these once? Taper burns, they're called, made with the tip of a lit candle, not for light, but for warding off evil. The heat was meant to purify, to create a boundary no ill spirit could cross. Some say the burns mimic the sun's light, a symbolic barrier against the darkness. Historians still argue whether these were acts of faith or acts of superstition, but in a time when those two often walked hand in hand, does the distinction really matter? A sliver of wind threads through the crack in the door, rustling your hair. The flame of a nearby votive bends and wavers before settling again, its glow stretching toward the darkened corners. You think of the mason outside, chisel in hand. And now, picture someone else, a villager, perhaps standing here in the lamplight, carefully lifting a candle to the doorway. Not rushing, not afraid, but steady, as if this small act could tip the scales in their favor. Further up the arch, your eyes catch something even fainter. A pair of tiny carved letters, nearly erased by time. Could be an initial, could be a sacred abbreviation. The stone around it is discolored, a lighter oval, where something might once have been fixed, a relic, perhaps, or a small cross long since removed. The absence feels deliberate. It's like a missing tooth you can't stop probing with your tongue. Behind you, the chancel glows with the gentle gold of candlelight, but you stay at the threshold, reluctant to leave. The doorway isn't just an entrance, it's a border between two worlds. Outside, mud and wind and the weight of the unknown. Inside, a space anchored by centuries of whispered prayers. You crouch slightly, running your fingertips over the cool flagstone at the base of the doorway. The surface here is smoother than the rest of the floor, worn by countless feet. Yet right in the center is a small, deliberate groove, shallow but distinct. A carpenter's mark? Or something else? You've read of which marks carved into. Threshold's a final line of defense that evil couldn't cross. Some take the form of daisy wheels, others simple intersecting lines meant to confuse malign spirits. Perhaps this groove once formed part of a larger pattern, its edges blurred by time and the shuffle of boots. A shadow shifts near the far aisle, and you glance up only to see the verger moving quietly between pews, his lantern casting a circle of light that floats across the walls. He doesn't acknowledge you, just continues his slow circuit, as if the building itself requires tending. It's like an old and dignified animal when he passes the doorway. You notice him glance just for a moment. It's the very marks you've been studying. There's something in that glance, a flicker of familiarity, almost like he's checking to make sure they're still there, still holding. You lean back against the cool stone and let your gaze travel once more over the arc of the doorway, inside and out. The symbols and burns, the initials and grooves, they're not ornamental. They're a language in stone, one the villagers might not all be able to read, but one they trust all the same. And as the last candle on the far wall gutters low, you realize that in this quiet, you've been standing in the most fiercely defended spot in the entire church, not the altar, not the tower, but here. The line between what's allowed in and what must be kept out? Asterisk. You step back out into the night, the heavy door closing behind you with the low, satisfying thud of oak meeting stone. The air feels colder now, and for a moment you just stand in the porch, shielded from the wind by thick walls and an arch that seems to hold its own warmth. From here, the doorway feels less like an opening and more like a mouth, ornate, solemn, and perhaps just a little too knowing. The porch itself is older than you expected, its timbers darkened to near black. The grain raised in deep ridges from centuries of damp and drying. The roof dips slightly, forming a shallow shelter where villagers might have gathered before and after services. Imagine them standing here on a market Sunday, shaking rain from their cloaks, gossiping in low voices about who had a good harvest, who lost a cow, and who, lured to an even quieter tone, was seen visiting a certain herbalist on the edge of the village, on the side walls of the porch. Carved into the sandstone, you find more marks. Some are shallow and decorative caterfoils, curling vines, a fragment of a saint's robe, but others are strange, spirals, overlapping lines, and circles scratched with quick, sure strokes. These are apotropaic symbols, meant to avert evil. A daisy wheel here, its petals radiating from a central point like the spokes of a wheel. It's an interlocking V motif there. It's often interpreted as a reference to the Virgin Mary. Historians still argue whether these carvings were commissioned by the church itself, or quietly added by parishioners who wanted an extra layer of insurance. You lean closer to one of the daisy wheels, running a fingertip over the shallow grooves. It's almost perfect, though one petal is skewed just enough to suggest a human hand rather than a mason's compass. That imperfection makes it feel personal, as though whoever carved it believed the act mattered more than the precision. Charm doesn't need to be flawless. It just needs to be there, above the arch. Just beyond your reach, you spot what looks like a cluster of small holes drilled in an oddly deliberate arrangement. 3 on the left, 2 on the right, and a single one dead center. It could be the remains of some long-lost wooden ornament, but you've read that such patterns sometimes served as demon traps, designed to lure malicious spirits into chasing an endless path within the carved lines or holes, never quite finding their way out. A gust of wind sweeps through the porch, carrying with it the scent of wet grass and something faintly sweet, maybe the last of the evening's baking. From the cottage next to the churchyard, the smell is comforting, but it's quickly chased away by the sharper temps of damp stone and moss. Your eyes drift to the low bench built into the side of the porch, worn smooth by generations of weary feet stopping here before crossing the tie threshold. On the underside of the bench, in the dim light, you notice a faint carving, a single eye, almond-shaped and unblinking. Not an uncommon symbol in folk protection meant to watch for harm when human eyes were elsewhere. Beyond the porch, the churchyard lies silent under the moon, a scatter of headstones leaning like tired sentinels. You wonder how many of those buried here once stood where you are now, pausing to trace a mark, murmur a prayer, or leave some small offering in a niche before stepping inside. Maybe a coin, maybe a sprig of rosemary, maybe something they wouldn't dare speak of aloud. Your gaze returns to the arch above the main doorway, where the light from within the church catches faint traces of red and gold paint in the deeper grooves of the carving. Centuries ago, this entrance might have been brightly colored figures of saints, scenes from scripture, or perhaps even the Archangel Michael with his sword, all picked out in vivid pigments. Today the color lingers like a ghost, but you can still imagine the effect, stepping into a portal that was both dazzling and daunting. Its beauty part of its power. A sound breaks your thoughts' footsteps on the path, slow and measured. A man in a heavy cloak approaches, a lantern swinging from his hand. He nods at you but doesn't speak, instead setting the lantern down just inside the porch. Without ceremony, he takes a stub of chalk from his pocket and bends toward the stone. Near the bottom of the doorway, in a few quick strokes, he draws a symbol, 2 intersecting lines with a small loop at one end. You watch, but don't ask. He gives a curt nod toward the church and walks on, leaving the chalk mark glowing faintly in the lantern's light. You've heard of this seasonal renewals of protective marks, particularly before important feast days, freshening the barrier, so to speak. Whether it's tradition, habit, or genuine belief hardly matters. The act itself is what anchors the protection. The villagers might not agree on theology. They agree on this: you keep the doorway guarded. Always your hand lingers on the cool edge of the stone arch as you finally step down into the churchyard. Behind you, the porch seems to shrink into the darkness. Yet the doorway remains lit from within, its marks and symbols quietly holding their post. It's an old kind of watchfulness, one that doesn't announce itself. Its maid never sleeps. Asterisk, you stand in the hush just beyond the porch. The doorway behind you breathes like a patient animal, stone warming, stone cooling, stone keeping. The village's worries parked neatly at the threshold. If the marks and burns are the handwriting, the belief that animates them is the voice. A soft, insistent whisper that says not past here. The villagers were never vague about what they hear. Protected was everything they could not repair with a broom or a spade, witches who traveled on wind, demons who loved corners, the sort of wandering spirits that slipped into houses the way drafts do, unnoticed until candles told on them. Mainstream fact finds your elbow and steers you gently in medieval and early modern Europe, less thresholds especially. Church thresholds were treated as liminal ground, the exact line where one realm yielded to another. The north side of many churches even carried a nickname, the Devil's Door, from the notion that an opening on that colder, shadowed wall gave darkness a preferred entrance. Some churches built a small north door and shut it tight at baptisms. To bar the departing evil, people rang Sanctus bells, chalked monograms VVs for Mary, IHs for Jesus, cratched daisy wheels, and burned taper marks. Not to decorate, but to draw a perimeter the world could understand. You picture a Sunday. In late autumn, sleet needling the air, breath turning white, and parishioners clustering in the porch while the bell tugs their ribs. A mother arriving with a baby swaddled in a mantle. An old farmer with a cramp in his hand from R's on a flail. A girl still smelling faintly of the cheese room. A mason who knows the doorway better than his own bedpost. Each passes the carved line, and each looks just a glance at the little I scratched under the bench, at the daisy wheel, at the taper burns. The confidence it gives is modest and practical, like finding a latch exactly where you expected it. Witches, in the village imagination, did not announce themselves with theme. Music. They were blamed for butter failing to come, cows overlooked into thin milk, children wasting with fevers that laughed at broth. Demons favored thresholds and roof angles the way cats do places between, where dust and attention both collect. And restless spirits? They followed stories and footsteps, tugging at doors as surely as debt. None of this is measurable, of course, but belief isn't a ruler. It's a blanket. The marks tuck the blanket in. A verger once told, "You eyes lowered." Voice decorously bored that on. Eve's known for thin veils, St. John's Eve. Halloween. The Ember Nights. He added a fresh chalk, cross low on the jam for the little ones, meaning both children and lesser mischiefs that behaved like children. He'd sweep it away after Mass, as if nothing had happened, the way you smooth a bed after worrying in it. Historians still argue whether clergy sanctioned such house priest gestures or merely looked away. Church records prefer tidy doctrine, while porches collect the smudges of practice. Quirky tidbit arrives in a hush of amusement. Some parishes kept slender bundle of door herbs near the porch, rosemary rowan, a thin twist of rush renewed. At regation-tide processions, sprig might be tucked behind a hinge until it browned to paper. Another might be laid in a stone niche and quietly replaced by the first hand that noticed. No rubric demanded it. The habit simply fit, like a glove someone forgot they ever borrowed. Joke 1. You entertain the idea of a parish office position. Titled Assistant to the Doorway, salary paid in rosemary, and extremely local fame. The line of protection wasn't only carved, it was walked. Think of the beating of the bounds, the annual parish procession tracing the boundary stones with psalms and taps. The priest and crowd would always pause at the church door after circling the outside world, as if reclosing a loop that kept both geography and gossip in their lanes. In that pause, the doorway bore witness to a negotiated peace. We'll keep the fields out there, and the fears out there too. Thank you kindly. Some marks aim to confuse rather than confront. Daisy Wheel's hexafoils offered a never-ending line, a little maze in a single stroke where harm might wander until it bored itself into politeness. The interlaced VVS created a visual Natave Maria, Ave Maria, like a polite but unanswerable question. A slim star scratched once, twice, thrice over itself could be St. John's sign or simply a star. Ambiguity, it turns out, is excellent. Camouflage. It's joke 2. You decide to adopt the daisy wheel as a personal to-do list if a task can't escape the loop. Perhaps it didn't deserve to be done. Mainstream Facts slides another note under your palm. Scorched taper marks. Cluster where hands can reach because fire was both tool and emblem. A little sun you could hold. No. You can still see the round kisses of flame and some porches browned into stone-like freckles. The practice traveled. Museum surveys in Britain cataloged hundreds of such burns, not only in churches but barns and manor doorways, always near thresholds. Always in little constellations. If malice is drawn to edges, you light the edge. Simple. Effective if only in the way of night. Light is. Your eyes return to the interlocking lines at knee height. A child could have scratched that. An anxious groom. A widow practicing courage. The porch bench remembers them all in its gentle hollow. A story comes back to you. A winter when Murrin worried the cattle and someone no one names Husk. A second wheel beneath the first, then tapped the jam with the iron keys before locking up for the night. Spring the calves came fine. The village thanked the vet and the wheel with equal sincerity and unequal paperwork. Historians still argue whether such correlations are memories, embroidery, or evidence of a coherent folk system. You suspect it's both a quilt of sense and story keeping cold off the same shoulders. The fear wasn't only local. Travelers carried other shapes with them. A sun wheel from farther south. A Triskelion learned at a market 2 shires over. A runish stave misremembered from a charm. Over centuries the porch became an anthology. If a mark promised to help, it stayed. If it offended no one important, it stayed louder. The church, in its stone patience. Let the threshold be a commons where orthodoxy and elbow knowledge nodded at each other without needing to agree. Here's a tiny practice that makes smile. On the morning of a funeral, some villagers would sweep the porch from threshold outward in a single, deliberate push, then lean the broom against the outer jamb until the bell tolled. So the sorrow goes the right way, an old woman explained, as if sorrow were a guest who occasionally needed pointing toward the road. The marks watched, unblinking, pleased to be included. Joke 3. You picture drafting an etiquette? Pamphlet for visiting spirits, kindly follow the arrows. Refreshments not provided. Do mind the chalk? If you listen hard enough, you can hear the arithmetic of reassurance the doorway performs. On a stormy night, bell, mark, taper. At a christening, seal the devil's door, cross the threshold. Fingers to the VV. On St. Lucy's morning, when dark is bossiest, 1 extra candle burn, 1 quick star scratched near the latch. None of these are loud gestures. They are size-sized, ordinary, portable across generations. That's why they matter. Ritual that needs trumpets dies of stage fright. Ritual a hand can keep alive survives everything except sandpaper and zeal. You step back and take in the whole scene as an ensemble. The faint remnants of paint in the arch. The tidy clusters of burns. The circles like little suns. The bench with its quiet eye. The chalk that will weather off in the next rain and be redrawn by the next hand. Witches, demons, wandering spirits, names for currents you can't see that still move the hair on your arms. The villagers met them with scratches and soot, with prayers and practice. Whether those marks held back anything supernatural is not a question the stone is prepared to answer. What they did hold back, reliably, was helplessness. And helplessness is the doorway trouble prefers. As the wind slides its shoulder against the porch again, you stand in the sweet spot just outside, where the marks work hardest. You're not sure whether you feel safer. Exactly. You do feel accompanied. Which might be the same thing once the candles are down to stubs, and the bell has decided it's someone else's turn to speak. The porch inhales, the porch exhales, the line holds. And beyond it, the night remembers its manners. Asterisk, the wind skims across the churchyard and raises gooseflesh along your forearms. It's a kind that says a storm is gossiping with the horizon. You step toward the nave again, not to go inside, but to crouch by the doorway where the stone meets the ground. There's a new dusting along the jam paler than the limestone, soft as flour, chalk. Someone has already begun the quiet work that keeps the weather on the correct side of courtesy. The permanent marks you've been tracing all evening are the bones. This is the skin renewed, rubbed off, redrawn, as the calendar and clouds require. You follow the fine white line with a fingertip, and it smudges obediently, leaving your skin with a pale comet tail. The line bends into a little loop near the threshold, makes a tidy cross, then runs up the vertical stone in 3 short strokes like ladder rungs for invisible feet that need reminding which way is out. A child could have done it. A priest could have done it. Anyone who owns a stub of chalk and a handful of worry could have done it. You imagine a householder arriving at dusk, whispering the names. He wants the doorway to remember wife, boy, cow. The bread that's rising, and drawing what his hand has always drawn when there's weather coming. Mainstream fact pads in with a candle's soft confidence in medieval and early modern parishes. Chalk and candles were as much liturgical as they were local. Candlemas early February saw the blessing of beeswax tapers for the year. Households took them home for storms, illnesses, and those nights when doorways felt too thin. Epiphany chalk blessings marking lintels with holy letters in the year are recorded in various forms, sometimes as the initials of the Magi, sometimes as a Latin blessing for the house. The church supplied the sacrament. The threshold supplied the canvas. A low door in the porch creaks, and the verger emerges again. This time with a small basket, a shallow dish, and a taper already smoldering like a polite volcano. He nods to you, sets the dish on the bench, and crumbles a bit of white into it with practical fingers. He doesn't draw dry, he mixes. A splash from a leather bottle turns chalk to paste, and with the business end of a goose quill, he traces a pale cross about knee height, then adds a looping mark like a fish unwinding. For the weather, he says without looking up, as if the weather might take offense at being named too loudly. More marks bloom quickly, 2 little stars like simplified daisies, a slender line that bends outward near the base, the door equivalent of pushing a chair under a table, and on the lintel, 3 letters that could be read 2 ways, depending on how the candle shakes. Quirky tidbit arrives with the quill. In some places, the letters stood for the 3 kings. In others, they were read as Christus Mansionum, Benedica, Christ bless this house. People recited whichever meaning fit their tongue, and sometimes both. The way you might give a friend 2 nicknames because both feel right. Joke 1. You decide medieval chalk had excellent branding. 1 product. 2 slogans, guaranteed to repel gloom and minor demons. Assembly required. You notice, he marks not only the stone but the wood of the door where fingers habitually rest before pushing. Oils will take the chalk faster there, so the line brightens in a satisfying way. He finishes with a small sun no, bigger than a coin tucked into the upper left corner, then leans back to consider the composition like an artist who's also very good at fetching coal. The taper's flame flares as a draft fingers the porch, and he shields it without thinking. Inside the basket, you glimpse more tools of impermanent guardianship. Extra chalk wrapped in linen. A stubby beeswax candle scored with faint rings measuring prayers by grooves and a twist of rosemary. He plucks the herb and brushes it once along the jamb as though adding fragrance to a letter before sealing it. Storm coming. He remarks to the stone, which of course already knows. Historians still argue whether these chalkings were sanctioned. Rites or domestic folkways tolerated because they hurt no one and calmed everyone. Parish records are tidy. Porches tell the messier truth grace happens where hands are. Boy in a saffron hood skids into the porch and nearly collides with the verger's basket. He's clutching a candle whose wick has the look of something pinched from the big stand. Inside, pious theft or delegated borrowing, who can say? The verger sighs, lights it from his taper, and the boy heads for the north wall, where superstition says drafts begin their careers. He touches the flame to 3 places at shoulder level, leaving the faintest, sooty half-moons. So it remembers, he says, gaze solemn as a bishop's. Though his boots are leaking, mainstream fact leans closer. People did light blessed candles during tempests. believing the smoke and prayer together could quell thunder and the malign that rode it. Bells were rung to break storms. Processional tapers met lightning with little portable suns, whether to summon God's favor or to reassure the heart. The choreography was the same: light against boom, line against breath. Joke 2. You privately rate a blessed beeswax taper as the medieval equivalent of a weather app offers guidance. Occasionally wrong, very comforting to consult. You step just outside to watch the sky marinate into slate. The first fat drops spatter the porch flagstones, darkening them in leopard spots. In the square, 2 women in indigo shawls hustle a covered basket between them. A dog, undecided on allegiance, paces the line between joining and judging. Over the well, someone has chalked a simple circle in a single letter, maybe the first. Of a name, maybe a monogram, aimed at any wandering thirsts that like to nest in water. The chalk will run in half an hour and be redrawn in the morning. It's the agreement. You don't grieve what's meant to be renewed. When the rain thickens, the verger returns to the lintel and whispers something as he touches the chalk letters with the taper's warm smoke. Wax scent rides the draft, honey and dust, and a little wool from someone's sleeve. You don't catch the words? You don't need to. The door understands tone. He blows the taper out and pinches the ember between finger and thumb, a practiced hiss, quirky tidbit shared like a secret recipe. A pinch of spent wick kept in a pouch by the door was thought to teach the night its manners. People carried crumbs of blessed wax the way modern pockets collect lint and courage. Historians still argue whether these temporary protections mattered more than the permanent ones. Some point to account books and episcopal sniffs to say chalk was mere folk embroidery on the garment of faith. Others, tracing layers of soot and calcium carbonate in old doorways. See the steady pulse of a community regulating its fear with gestures that cost almost nothing and ask only a handspan of time. Fingertip spect, the argument misses the point. The point is that someone bothered. You glance down and find a cat has joined the congregation, a lean black mouser with one white whisker like an apostrophe. She steps neatly along the sill and sits just inside the chalked loop, tail curled around to complete the circle. She blinks at you, then at the verger, then at the sky, which is doing its best impression of a bucket. Joke 3. You consider deputizing her as assistant to the doorway. Salary payable in cream and the right to veto drafts. Rain drums on the porch roof. A round, steady sound that sands off the edges of thought. The chalk brightens where it's fresh, pales where earlier lines have surrendered to damp. That's all right. There will be other afternoons, other storms, other hands. Chalk is the village's way of telling itself in pencil first. You watch a bead of water roll past a small sunmark and split, choosing to courses inside or out. Not tonight. The line holds when the shower eases. The boy returns the candle stub to the basket with a reverence that would make any inventory. Log purr. The verger wipes his hands on his tunic, tips whatever hat a verger assumes in the absence of a hat, and slips back inside. You remain a moment longer, letting the damp air rinse your lungs, then touch the chalk cross once, lightly, the way you might tap a friend's shoulder in thanks. The chalk leaves the faintest ghost on your skin-portable boundary. Pocketable promise. The doorway sighs a timber noise, a stone noise, an old building's contented exhale. The storm thinks about trying the latch again. The latch thinks about laughing. Asterisk the rain thins to strings, then to mist. And the church seems to sit up a little straighter, as if pleased with its own waterproofing. You step back under the porch as the door opens and releases a drift of beeswax and old hymn into the gray. The priest appears, not grand, not severe, just a man who's learned how to keep multiple kinds of peace without spilling any of them. His cassock is a shade too long and has collected a fringe of damp dust, the sartorial equivalent of a sigh. He nods to you, to the chalk, to the cat who blinks as if she's owed a formal greeting, and to the sky, which pointedly ignores him. He doesn't make speeches. Instead, he does what you suspect he always does. He picks up what the village has placed at his feet. Literally. He collects the basket the verger left, tests the chalk with a thumbnail, and warms the beeswax between his palms until it remembers. Being part of a honeycomb, Storm gave us a rehearsal, he says, voice low enough to keep from waking anxieties. We'll do the rest before Vespers. He starts not with the doorway, but with the font just inside, where Stone has a memory. For small splashes, a thimble of water goes into a dish, chalk follows, and he stirs with a fingertip until the paste goes the color of pale ash. He glances at you as if to say, nothing complicated, nothing noisy, and moves to the threshold where he spreads a thin band across the lower lintel with a motion so practiced it hardly exists. The band is narrow, not a barricade so much as a reminder to whatever passes that someone is paying attention. Mainstream fact slips into the scene. Like a choir boy, careful of steps, medieval and early modern clergy often blessed candles at Candlemas. And chalk it epiphany for parishioners to take home, a sanctioned thread linking liturgy to lintel. Parish books record the expenditures. Homilies mention the symbolism light in winter, guidance in darkness. The priest doesn't narrate any of that. He simply works, letting the gesture carry its own sermon. You can tell he's a diplomat by training and temperament. He draws a neat Marian monogram interlocked VSE of the hinge, an orthodox sign of intercession. Then, with the faintest twitch of a smile, he traces a tiny daisy wheel, no bigger than a coin in the corner, where drafts like to gossip. He doesn't glance around to see who notices, he knows who will. The line between sanctioned symbol and folkmark is thinner than chalk. He walks it without scuffing his hem. People sleep better when their hands have helped, he says, as much to the stone as to you. And when they sleep, fewer quarrels. It's a theology of the doorstep. Grace measured in uninterrupted bread baking in neighbors. Borrowing salt without needing extra salt in the conversation, smooths the beeswax along a seam in the wood, sealing a splinter that has been waiting 3 winters for attention. The cat supervises, kneading the bench with approval exactly 3 times, as if the office of feline oversight requires no more. Out in the yard, a flock of damp parishioners approaches like a dark cloud that has decided to tithe. One woman carries a small sprig of rosemary. A man holds a stubby candle as if it's a guest of honor. Little boy hides, a horseshoe behind his back with the furtiveness of someone unsure whether he's brought contraband or contribution. The priest receives each item with the same untroubled nod. To the rosemary, leave it by the hinge. To the candle, we'll light it at the north wall. To the horseshoe, outside, above the porch beam. For the iron's sake, quirky. Tidbit surfaces with a chuckle from the oldest parishioner on Regation Tide. She says, her grandmother used to bake tiny breadlarks and hand one to each child to eat only after tapping the church door 3 times so trouble flies the other way. The priest smiles and does not rule on the ornithological merit of pastry, simply says, bring them next year too, which is the ecclesiastical form of, if it helps, let it help. Joke 1. You make a mental note to endorse all bird-shaped, baked goods on principle, theological or otherwise. Historians still argue whether clergy blessed these folk protections out of sincere belief. It's pastoral prudence or quiet exasperation with endless domestic anxieties. Some point to synod, decrees frowning on superstition. Others note inventories listing blessed chalk and candles for household use. The record gives you both frown and nod. Reality, standing here getting gently misted, gives you a priest who moves between both with a gait that never stumbles. He invites the little procession into the porch and, almost without ceremony, divides the tasks. Thomas, the north jamb. Margaret, that corner above the bench. Alice, draw your mark low, where the cat sits. A rustle of sleeves, the soft scratch of chalk. The little boy's horseshoe lifted by the verger to the outer beam iron kissing wood with a happy, practical thud. The priest intones a short blessing in words the village has half memorized, half embroidered over years. It's not grand. It sighs to the doorway. Then he does something that explains why everyone keeps coming back. He steps aside. He lets the hands that worry also be the hands that ward. He corrects nothing. He changes nothing. He only adds a cross at the end, the punctuation that ties disparate clauses into a sentence the building can understand. joke. 2. You decide he's less a conductor than a very good editor, the sort who trims nothing that sings. Inside, Gus teases the candles, but the flames hold. He walks to the north wall with the stubby taper and touches its wick to a standing light. 3 breaths, he says to the boy, who counts them out like a slow drummer. Smoke braids and vanishes. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. The boy's grin has the brightness of a new hymn tune. The priest snuffs the wick with damp fingers, and for a heartbeat the porch smells like wool, honey, and a memorized prayer. A farmer clears his throat and produces, from the pocket of his jerkin, a tiny lead token stamped with a crude star market change that has decided to become an amulet. He offers it up with the same face he'd use to hand over an overdue tithe. The priest turns it in his palm, considering both metallurgy and morale. Above the latch he decides, and presses it into a crack, where it sits like a very small moon. The farmer's shoulders drop half an inch, measurable absolution. Mainstream fact strolls back through the doorway with the verger. Church porches functioned as social courts, contract halls, and transaction spaces. Bans were posted here, tithes discussed, misdeeds mended. It makes sense that the threshold also hosted the village's risk management department. The priest's job, as you see it now, isn't to abolish folk practice, but to house it give. At a corner where it can be tidied and blessed, less likely to trip anybody in the dark. The sky decides it has had its say, and lightens by a shade you can only call hopeful pewter. The priest wipes a chalk smudge from his sleeve with the same care he might use on a chalice. Evening will hold, he says, meaning both the weather and whatever else rubs its shoulders against the edges of the day. He turns the basket over to the verger, who tucks the rosemary sprig, so its scent greets the next hand. The cat, duty done, performs a luxuriant stretch and relocates to the center of the mat, where she becomes the official paperweight for drafts. Joke 3. You consider appointing her chair of the committee on unseen breezes. The small crowd disperses without fanfare, each person taking back into the damp lanes the reassurance they helped manufacture. You remain with the priest a moment longer, and he says what perhaps he says to anyone who lingers. Stone remembers. He means the doorway. He might also mean your hands, which now carry a dusting of chalk and a little warmth from beeswax. He neither promises nor warns. He only nods at the marked arch with the affection of a shepherd who knows which sheep bite and which simply bleat at storms. When you finally step out into the churchyard, the grass has set pearls on every blade, and the markers lean at their traditional angles toward secrets they will not share. You glance back once, not to check the work, but the way you glance at a sleeping child to confirm that sleep, that miracle of ordinary blessing, is still happening. The doorway looks very slightly pleased with itself, which is a lot for stone. The marks seem brighter, not because they are, but because your eye has learned their grammar. In the days come after, the alliance between faith and folk habit holds like a well-made hinge, quiet, strong, and very good at its job. Asterisk by the time you wander down the slope from the church porch, the evening is halfway to darkness. A small wind turns the grass into a shifting script you can almost read, and the damp air tucks itself into the folds of your cloak. Somewhere in the hedgerow, a blackbird fusses about bedtime arrangements, delivering a last-minute scold to a rival, then falling silent. You follow the faint sound of running water until you reach a narrow stone bridge, the sort that looks like it was built as a dare between 2 stonemasons, and then somehow survived for centuries. The stream beneath chuckles softly, unconcerned with the larger currents of human worry. Just beyond the bridge lies a cluster of cottages half-timbered, slightly stooped, as if leaning in to hear one another's secrets. Their doors are smaller than modern sensibilities would allow, which might be practical, less draft, or mystical, less room for trouble to squeeze through. You notice something right away? Many of them bear carvings around the frame. Some are simple, just parallel grooves like tally marks. Others are elaborate, with interlocking loops or petals that radiate from a central point. Even in the dim light, you can see the play of shadow across their shallow cuts. Mainstream historical fact strolls in like a villager carrying a lantern. Apotropaic marks. often called witch marks today, were common on medieval and early modern buildings, especially around thresholds and hearths. They were meant to deflect, confuse, or trap malevolent spirits. Shapes that either mimicked protective symbols from church art or acted as mazes for supernatural forces. The daisy wheel, also known as a hexafoil, is one of the most popular designs. You crouch to look closer at one doorway's decoration. The grooves are shallow but deliberate, cut with the steady hand of someone who had done this more than once. A child could run their finger along the loops and never lose the line. The wood is worn to a warm sheen where countless palms have brushed against it. You almost expect it to be warm to the touch, but it's cool, slightly damp, holding the memory of afternoon rain. From inside the cottage comes the smell of baking bread, the kind that makes you consider whether you could politely invent a reason to be invited in. The door opens before you can test your improvisation skills. A woman in a linen cap steps out with a basket, glances at you, and follows your gaze to the carving. "Keeps him guessing," she says, without specifying who them might be. Joke 1. You decide it could mean anything from witches to door-to-door turnip salesman. She pats the wood like it's a well-behaved dog, then hurries off into the dusk. Quirky tidbit arrives with a whispered memory from an elderly man. You meet further along. His grandmother used to rub soot into the carved lines every Candlemas to refresh the mark so it would stay sharp in the eyes of whatever it was meant to repel. He claims she once caught a traveling peddler tracing the loops with his finger, muttering under his breath, and chased him off with the broom. "Not all travelers are welcome," he shrugs, as if this is both obvious and necessary to state. You pass another door where the carvings form an odd combination, part daisy wheel, part Marian monogram. The hybrid design draws you in. And here's where historians still argue whether such overlaps were deliberate syncretism, a blending of church-sanctioned symbols with folk motifs, or simply the product of a local carver who liked to experiment. Some scholars think the two traditions reinforced each other. Others suspect the church tolerated the carvings as long as they looked vaguely pious from a distance. The surviving marks don't answer the debate. They just keep sitting in their doorframes, doing whatever job they were meant to do. One doorframe has no carving at all, but bears a faint chalk outline, smudged almost to invisibility. You picture someone hastily marking it in bad weather, not caring if it was artful, only if it was done. Chalk fades quickly. Perhaps that's the point. Renew it often so the act stays fresh in the household's memory. There's comfort in the repetition. Even if no one agrees on the mechanics of the magic, you pause at a cottage where a candle burns in the window, its flame steady despite the draft. The doorway has 3 concentric circles carved into the lintel. The innermost ring contains a tiny iron nail, driven in so precisely it looks ornamental. You think about iron's long history as a spirit, deterrent horseshoes, nails, keys, hung by the bed, and how this nail, so small and quiet, might carry more peace of mind than a locked gate. Further along, you hear the rhythmic thok-thok of someone working wood. The sound comes from an open shed where a man in a russet tunic is leaning over a door laid flat on trestles. He's cutting a fresh daisy wheel into the upper corner, his knife tracing each petal with patient pressure. A candle flickers beside him, lighting the curls of wood that fall like pale petals to the dirt floor. You ask how long it will last. Depends on the weather, he says, and the will to keep it. He wipes the blade, runs a thumb along the groove to test depth, and nods to himself like a craftsman finishing a contract with the unseen. As you leave the cluster of cottages, sky deepens into proper night. A few stars peer between gaps in the clouds. You glance back once more, noticing how the carvings catch even the faintest light, pale lines that stand out like chalk on slate. There's something reassuring about how ordinary they look now, just part of the architecture, unremarkable unless you know to see them. The village is good at this, hiding the extraordinary in plain sight. Joke 2. You think about carving? One over your own apartment door, though you'd have to explain it to your landlord, which might end up being scarier than the spirits. Somewhere behind you, which bell marks the hour, not a summons, just a reminder. The carvings you've just seen will keep doing their silent work, whether or not anyone notices. Maybe that's the real magic. their persistence. The quiet continuity of people who keep making them generation after generation. In the end, it's not about believing or not believing.
Oh.
It's about the habit of protection, the small rituals. That say, we've thought about what might come to the door and we're ready. And so you keep walking, your boots pressing the wet earth into the shape of the lane. The carvings fading into memory, but still there, threaded into the fabric of the place like knots in a tapestry. The lane twists upward toward the older part of the village, the part where the houses lean a little harder into the road as though competing for space. You pass under a sagging timber beam that marks the start of what the locals call the church. Reach a stretch where the street narrows so much that if two carts met, one would have to reverse all the way back. Here, the smell changes. The temps of chimney smoke is joined by something sweet, almost herbal, like rosemary or lavender hung up to dry. Ahead, the silhouette of the church grows with every step, its squat tower squared against the night sky. The building itself is a patchwork of centuries flint walls from the 12th century at the base. 15th century windows high above, and a porch that looks just new enough to still carry the scent of fresh oak. You approach the porch first, because that's where the village's most elaborate doorway protection lives. Mainstream historical fact greets you at the threshold. Medieval church porches were not just entryways but gathering places, shelters. For village business and occasionally makeshift courts, people passed through them daily. They were natural locations for protective symbols marks, scratched into the soft limestone or carved into oak to guard a holy space from whatever the wind or the congregation might carry in. You run your hand lightly along the oak frame, tracing shallow grooves that overlap like a web. Some form neat daisy wheels. Others meander into symbols you can't quite place, half-formed letters, intersecting lines that suggest a child's game board. Quirky tidbit. In some churches, these carvings doubled as practice for apprentice masons or carpenters, learning to steady their tools before working on the real commissions. The result is a protective charm that's part folk magic, part vocational training exercise. A candle burns in a glass lantern just inside the porch. Throwing its light across the stone floor, you notice faint chalk marks circling the door hinges. So light, they might vanish with the next rain. Someone's kept them fresh. The idea of layering protections, carving for permanence, chalk for immediacy feels almost like wearing both a seatbelt and a life jacket. You duck inside the porch. The air's suddenly cooler. A bench runs along each side, smooth from centuries of use. Above your head, the timber beams carry more marks, hidden in plain sight, where only the curious would look. Historians still argue whether these high-up symbols were meant for humans, or for spirits placed, where only the non-corporeal might see them clearly. You imagine a spectral visitor floating just under the roofline, squinting at the looping lines before deciding it's too much trouble to enter. The door itself is a masterpiece, heavy oak planks bound by iron straps, with a great ring-shaped handle. At eye level, a starburst pattern is carved directly into the wood, each ray radiating from a central point no bigger than a coin. You try to picture the moment of its making, a craftsman bent over the panel, steadying his wrist, perhaps, humming to himself. Maybe he worked in silence, the weight of the church's stillness pressing in. Stroke of his blade, both an act of skill and a small prayer. Joke 1. You briefly consider taking up protective symbol, carving yourself. Suspect your first attempt would look more like a wonky pizza. A faint rustle draws your attention to the far side of the porch. An elderly woman in a deep indigo cloak is kneeling there, her fingers busy with a small pouch. She sprinkles something, a pinch of dried herbs, into the corner where wood meets stone. As she glances up, meets your gaze and smiles faintly.
Ice?
4. The drafts, she says.
Oh.
Whether she means the cold air or unwelcome spirits is left deliciously vague. Then she's gone, slipping out into the night without sound. From here, you can see the nave through the slightly ajar door. The scent of beeswax and old stone drifts out, wrapping around you. Somewhere inside, a rope sways gently from the bell tower, still moving from the earlier toll. Your fingertips rest on the cool wood of the doorframe, feeling the small ridges of centuries-old cuts. Another curious mark catches your eye, a triple V scratched into the stone just outside the doorway. Scholars debate whether these stand for Virgo Virginum, reference to the Virgin Mary, or are simply repeated protective initials. In either case, they're sharp enough to snag a fingertip. And you can't help but think about all the hands that have passed here. Brushing the same place for reassurance, the porch floor holds its own stories. Small, circular depressions mark where people have twisted their feet in prayer or nervous habit, wearing the stone as if it were no more than wax. These two are a kind of unplanned protectioner, rhythm of movement that might comfort as much as it guards. Quirky detail number 2 arrives when you spot a narrow slot in the wall by the bench. At first you think it's for holding candles, but a passing thought suggests it could have been a place to tuck written charms. Imagine scraps of parchment slipped inside, ink fading but intention still humming quietly as you step back out. Into the night, the wind brushes past you, not unkindly. The porch stands behind you like a watchful figure, its carvings and scratches and herbs all layered together into a single unspoken message. We are paying attention. The light from the lantern flickers once, as if acknowledging your departure. Joke 2. You decide you might need one of these porches at home, if only to keep out door-to-door energy suppliers. The church tower looms above, but it feels less like a threat and more like a steady heartbeat for the village. As you move away, the marks fade into shadow, but you know they're still there, doing the quiet work they've always done, warding, remembering, standing guard through centuries of evenings just like this. Asterisk the path from the church slopes, gently toward the river, the kind that glimmers silver even under the thinnest sliver of moon. You walk slowly, the mud pulling at your boots, until you find yourself on the stone footbridge that leads toward the mill. The hum of water over the weir is steady, almost hypnotic, exactly the sort of sound that could lull you into leaning over just a bit too far, down by the water's edge. The old mill building squats like it's been there since the beginning of time. In the dim light, you can make out its weathered beams and mossy roof, but what draws your eye is the small archway where the miller's side door sits. Its frame is rough-hewn, the wood worn pale from years of damp wind, but carved. Into its lintel is a mark you've not seen before: 2 interlocking circles, each filled with a crisscross pattern like a woven net. Mainstream historical fact slips into place here in medieval river communities. Doorways near the water were often marked with symbols meant to ward off spirits that were believed to travel along currents. It was thought that evil could ride the river just as easily as it could the road. So the entrances most vulnerable to that flow needed extra protection. As you run a fingertip over the circles, you feel shallow grooves and tiny chips where the carving knife must have caught on a stubborn knot in the wood. Quirky tidbit: some rural communities claimed these knot imperfections actually improved the charm's effectiveness, like a hiccup in the design could confuse a spirit into losing its way entirely. You can't decide if that's clever or just woodworking optimism. A faint clank echoes from inside the mill. The scent of damp grain seeps through the door, mingling with the river's cold breath. You step closer and notice faint white lines drawn directly on the stone threshold, another layer of symbols. This time in chalk, they're more geometric here, almost like small mazes. Maybe the idea was the same: keep anything unwelcome too busy to cross. Historians still argue whether these chalk labyrinths were purely functional, or if they also carried a symbolic meaning tied to biblical journeys. Either way, you wouldn't mind trying one out on your front porch, just to see if it works on nosy neighbors. Asterisk joke 1. You picture an evil spirit arriving here, seeing all the lines and circles, and deciding to just float downriver to the next village with a less confusing welcome mat. You step back, your boots crunching on the frost-crusted grass by the bridge. From this angle, you can see the mill's main door further up, under the larger gable. Its frame has a different mark: a 6-pointed star with tiny drilled holes at each tip. The holes, you realize, must have once held small pegs or perhaps sprigs of dried herbs, wedged in for an extra dose of protective charm. Asterisk, the sound of the river fills your ears again, but there's something else underneath it: a rhythmic creak, like a slow heartbeat in wood. You glance toward the water wheel, half submerged in shadow. Even in near darkness, it's easy to imagine the mill running at full tilt in daylight. Villagers bringing sacks of grain, chatting in the doorway while waiting for their turn. You picture them leaning casually against these carved frames, maybe not even noticing the symbols above their heads. But trusting them all the same, an owl calls from the hedgerow nearby, low and deliberate. Swings slice the air as it glides over the river, vanishing into the black beyond. You pull your cloak, tighter not so much against the cold, but against the sense that the night is paying attention to you just as much as you are to it. Another oddity catches your eye as you cross the bridge. Under the arch, where the water slaps against the stone, someone has etched small fish shapes into the blocks. They're crude, no more than a few scratches, but they shimmer faintly with lichen. Perhaps they were blessings for a good couture, maybe, just maybe. Talisman against whatever lurked beneath the surface. Joke 2. You decide that if the symbols are for keeping river monsters away, they've worked flawlessly so far, though. That could just be because river monsters are lazy and prefer warmer climates. You linger for a while, watching the moonlight dance over the water before turning back toward the village. The mill and its symbols remain behind you, quiet and steady, as the sound of the river fades. Every mark you've seen tonight seems to stack in your mind like layers of a single long spell, stretching across centuries, spoken in wood, stone, and chalk. As the lane curves away from the water, you spot a final detail, a small wooden gate, nearly falling apart, leading to a footpath between hedges. Single crossbar has a mark carved so faintly you almost miss it, a spiral, just large, enough to rest your thumb inside. You press it once, a small, private ritual. Before stepping past, the village feels different now, as though its patterns and protections have become part of the air you're breathing. You realize you've begun to notice things you'd missed. Before, a faint rune scratched into a barn door, a piece of iron nailed above a window, a sprig of something green tied with twine under an eave. Not grand gestures, just quiet ones. Little doorways within the larger doorway of the night. Asterisk, the path climbs gently back toward the heart of the village, winding between cottages whose thatched roofs glimmer faintly under the moon. You can feel the day's dampness settling into the earth, the scent of wet leaves and distant wood smoke drifting on the air. By now, every door you pass seems to hold a story, a shallow groove in the lintel, a faint chalk line half washed away by rain, or a rusty horseshoe hung so high it's almost part of the sky. Near the churchyard wall, you come to one of the oldest houses in the village. Its doorway is narrow and slightly bowed, as if the years have coaxed the timbers into a gentle stoop. Above it, carved deep into the beam, is a starburst pattern that fans outward from a central point. Mainstream historical fact: this type of design, sometimes called a daisy wheel, was widely believed in the Middle Ages to trap evil spirits in an endless loop, forcing them to follow the pattern instead of crossing into the home. Quirky tidbit: in some villages, these daisy wheels were also scratched into baking boards and even the bottoms of bread loaves because, according to local superstition, spirits apparently couldn't resist the urge to walk in circles before tasting fresh bread. You imagine a particularly determined ghost giving up in frustration. Drifting off in search of simpler snacks, you crouch to trace the lines of the daisy wheel with your fingertip. The grooves are rough, the wood splintering slightly where the chiseled bit deep, and wonder who carved it. Someone practical like a village carpenter, or a worried parent with just enough skill to score the lines. Historians still argue whether such symbols were the work of trained craftsmen or simply made by householders themselves, copying patterns they'd seen elsewhere. The truth might be lost. The mark remains. Joke 1. You picture a medieval teenager being told to mind the door, deciding to carve a daisy wheel instead of actually keeping watch. The church tower looms ahead, its bells long since silent for the night. You step under the stone archway that leads to the porch, where shadows deepen and every sound is muffled. The wooden church door is studded with iron nails, but it's the doorway's inner curve that catches your attention. Faint looping scratches worn smooth by centuries of hands and weather. Some are deliberate shapes, circles, crosses, and small grids, while Others seem like idle doodles. Together, they form a palimpsest of hope, fear, and habit, just beyond the porch. In the faint moonlight, you spot a narrow slit window. Sill beneath it holds a cluster of dried herbs, bound with red thread. The sight feels almost defiant, as though someone wanted to make sure the church itself was as protected as any home. It's a reminder that in this time, faith and folk belief weren't separate. They braided together like rope, each strand reinforcing the other. Joke 2. You wonder if the vicar ever noticed the herbs and decided they were just an early form. A floral arrangement, you linger in the porch's stillness, letting your eyes adjust until the carved details become clearer. A faint 5-pointed star sits near the hinge, so small you have to tilt your head to see it. Another spiral winds its way just above the threshold, its end vanishing into a crack in the stone. Your hand rests briefly on the heavy door, and a moment you imagine stepping inside, pews dimly lit by candles, the smell of wax and dust, the silence thick enough to make your footsteps sound like drum beats. But instead, you step back, feeling the cool air wrap around you once more. As you walk away from the church, the lane ahead glimmers faintly with frost. The village is utterly quiet now, every doorway shut, every charm in place. You think about how many of these marks have survived not because someone decided to preserve them, but simply because no one bothered to erase them. They've endured, by blending in, by becoming part of the woodstone and air itself. You pass a final doorway on the edge of the village, its frame leaning slightly outward, like it's trying to catch the last of the moonlight. Above it, a crudely drawn spiral wavers left, then right, before looping inward. It's imperfect, a little lopsided, but still somehow purposeful. You press your palm to it, feeling the texture of the grain under your skin. And for a moment, the cold seems to ease. It's not that you believe. Exactly, it's just that here, surrounded by centuries of habit and hope carved into wood and stone, it feels natural to join in. You keep your hand there for a heartbeat longer, then turn away. The village fading into shadow behind you. Word count: 1086 300-word wind, down. Lane ahead widens into open fields, and the dark begins to soften. A pale mist curls low to the ground, clinging to the grass and the hedgerows, muffling the edges of the world. You walk slowly now, letting each step settle before taking the next, the crunch of frost underfoot blending with the distant murmur of the river. In your mind, the doorways remain wooden beams, etched with circles, spirals, and stars. Thresholds marked with chalk, quiet porches hiding bundles of herbs. Each one feels less like a relic and more like a steady heartbeat, pulsing gently through the centuries. The air is cooler here, but it's the kind of cold that wakes you up just enough to notice the warmth still in your chest. The moon hangs low, casting a silver sheen over the path, and the silence is no longer heavy, it's calm, balanced, safe. You picture the village settling into its slumber, every symbol in place, every mark doing its quiet, unremarkable work. Nothing dramatic, nothing fierce, just patient protection, the kind that lingers without demanding thanks. It's a comfort you didn't expect, like finding an extra blanket at the foot of the bed. Your pace slows again, until you're almost standing still. The night folds gently around you, the horizon softening as if the world itself is drifting toward sleep. And in that stillness, the last flickers of the village fade from sight, leaving only the quiet rhythm of your breathing and the low hum of the earth beneath your feet. Somewhere far behind, a door swings shut with a faint click. You smile to yourself, knowing that somewhere, someone's charm has done its job for the night.